Do you have that somebody in your life that inspires you to be the best person that you can be? Maybe even do better at work, and not because the boss said so, but because they inspire you to do that. Well, I had such a person in my life. One of my previous employers, actually, he was the owner of the company, a small engineering firm, many, many years ago. I just found out, sadly enough, he passed away late last year. Now, I was busy in my life, all wrapped up in my own problems and issues, and I didn't even notice. And of course, it's been several years since I've seen him, but I can still tell you he left a lasting imprint on my life. Welcome back to the hustle, everybody, and welcome back to the grind. And thanks again joining in for today. And today's a little bit of a brisk one. We've got ourselves a little bevy. This one's feeling a little bitter today. It's not tasting as good, but hey, we'll take it. It's warm and it's cold outside, so it works really well. But I want to talk about a little story about somebody that was a big inspiration in my life. You know, my father was one of my biggest inspirations in my life, and there was a lot of great things and lessons I've learned from him. But there was another such individual that I took a lot of lessons from this person. He wasn't out there to try to teach me a lesson. He was out there to just enjoy his life to the fullest. And that's a big part of the reason I find him such an inspiration. You know, sadly, this world has to take everybody away, and at some point we all sort of meet the maker, hopefully later than sooner. But unfortunately, one of my biggest inspirations just passed at the ripe age of 70 years. And 70 years old really strikes deep, because it's a real reminder that we're not here that long. It's not a long life that we generally live, and it's just very, very heartbreaking when you see people striving to enjoy what's the end or that last third of their life, the retirement phase, the golden years, if you will. Everybody preaches that we're good for 83 average life expectancy as per Canada's statistics. I don't even call that a median. I think it's just those numbers just don't resonate to me. And I think a lot of people that I'm seeing and hearing just don't make it anywhere near that. And one of my biggest inspirations, only making 70 years of age, it was clearly a candle that burned out way too soon. And the reason I say that, scale this back many, many years ago. I joined an organization. As a matter of fact, I was doing some other work. I was throwing resumes, and I was struggling to get jobs. I was struggling to get a bite. I was struggling to land anything decent. And, even with a decent education and some experience, I still couldn't land a decent job. But I dropped in a resume at this organization, a small engineering firm, many, many years ago. And I got a call. I actually got a call back, one of very few. And I went in for an interview, and there's this gentleman standing in front of me, looking very spry, energetic, big smile, almost like a Cheshire cat. And I kind of thought, wow, this guy's a breath of fresh air. Most of the interviews I've been to, this grumpy old guy that just doesn't want to look to be, not appearing to be very approachable. But this gentleman seemed a little different to me. And I don't know why, I don't know how, but he seemed almost like there was an aura of sunshine around him. It sounds so cheesy, I know, it really does. But there was something I picked up on right from day one when I first met him, that he had something. There was some kind of positivity, a personality trait that was very magnetic, if you will. And he was a great guy. After the interview, which really wasn't much of an interview, it was really more of like, okay, what kind of school did you do? Where did you work last? You know what, that's okay. We'll teach you whatever you need to know. We'll teach you here as we go. And I thought, wow, this is a really, a breath of fresh air, just a real inspiring thought that here we have somebody that's putting their faith in me, that I haven't proven anything. I didn't have really relatable experience, even though I had some experience in other ways. But it really I wasn't that well vested in the high voltage industry, as it were, at that point. See, because this was my sort of getting my feet wet in the high voltage world. And so I got hired on, and, I started working through and learning a lot of the ins and outs of the industry. And he was a big part of inspiring me, showing me, teaching me the ropes. As a matter of fact, you look at those power lines up there, and he taught me a lot of things. He taught me a lot of new tricks, a lot of tricks I had never even dreamed of knowing. He taught me one of the big things, stress cones, high voltage terminations, splices, things that I could never dream of. Now, I come from the electrical world, the high voltage industry. I kind of understand that fundamentally. But he showed me in the real world how it worked. When you have a high voltage cable, you either run it in air like that and it hangs off an insulator, or if you're going to run it next in close proximity of other equipment, then you need to shield it, and it has to have a proper insulation, 100%, 133% insulation. They're rated on the thickness and the amount that it can resist the forces from the magnetic field to emit to adjacent grounded structures or other fixtures or, metallic housings of the equipment, whatever. The point is not about him teaching me how to terminate stress cones. The point is he taught me a lot of the ropes, the ins and outs, parts of the industry that very few people understand well, and even less can do it. And so he taught me a lot of these tricks, the ins and outs. So much, in fact, so he pretty much almost took me under his wing. And by the time I finished my career with that particular organization, I had probably terminated somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 terminations. Quite a few. That was one of my mainstays. And I learned a lot of tricks along the way and testing, commissioning of high voltage equipment. But stress cones, high voltage splices were a big part of that. As a matter of fact, I did some of the largest power cables you can ever imagine, 72 kV. Any higher than that, you've got to be exposed like that, hanging them off a power line and insulators. So without getting into too much of the technical mumbo jumbo, the point of the matter is I was exposed to a whole vast variety of different equipment, different technologies, different, ways of maintaining this work, and really just working in the industry as a whole. I just learned a lot from this gentleman. Okay, great. Well, a lot of us learn a lot. It's called mentorship or apprenticeships. But you know what? I've had senior workers that have taken me as being a young apprentice, and certainly a younger, more inexperienced worker. And many of them have been good, and a lot of them have taught me a lot of little tricks and ins and outs. But this gentleman went way beyond that. See, there was times that I quite often found to myself that we'd be, in a group environment, and then there were some other people that were maybe new to the game, and they just didn't seem to really be grasping some of the concepts. They really didn't seem to be that dialed in. They didn't seem to really understand it, nor did they seem to really care all that much. But yet, there's my old boss looking at these people like, hey, we can work through this. I saw traits in him that not just was he good and smart, and he inspired me to do the best work I could, because I actually wanted to be good at that, and I became some of the best. I even got to a point where I was braiding my shields. You get those concentric neutrals, for those of you in the business know. I would actually braid them. I wouldn't just twist them, throw them in the end of a drill and spin them tight. No, you have to ground the shields, and a concentric neutral, I would actually braid them. I love the way it looked, and you could go on a lot of termination boxes today, and you'll find a lot of equipment that I've gone and terminated, and you'll find braids, and that's probably me, because very few people will take the time and the effort to do that. But I did it because I love doing it, and I wanted to be the best at it, and I certainly wanted to put my mark on the game. But he inspired me to do that. He was just such an individual that he didn't just tell you to do it. He was always doing it with such that happy demeanor, such a friendly face. He was always didn't matter what was going on, if things were good or things were bad. He was always just looking for the solutions. He was always willing to help. And the funny thing was, he always had that smile on his face. It's such an interesting time. I think back, I can't still to this day, when he was teaching some of those other people that you and some of your coworkers kind of assumed were almost unteachable, he would take them to the side, and he'd be patient and, show a little empathy in the fact that, some couldn't maybe pick it up, or they were getting frustrated and they just couldn't get the concepts. And yet there he was, working through it, time in, time out, constantly, always having the patience, showing that, he had faith in anybody, even those that maybe didn't show the talent, even those that, he didn't. Let's put it this way. Let's draw a hockey analogy. he didn't expect a Connor McDavid level of talent out of somebody that was playing bantam D level hockey. It's kind of a weird thing, but that is kind of what I saw in him. Is he took anybody, talented or otherwise, and he would still work with them, and the patience shone through, and always I saw this level of patience and empathy and just overall personality that showed that he cared and he wanted to help. And that was a true inspiration to me, something that you don't see very often these days, and even more so from an owner of the company. See, he could have pretty much just hired the top talent and just skidded everybody else, but he didn't do that. And it's not like he underpaid. Everybody was getting paid very fairly in the industry, and yet he would be willing to take on those, those diamonds in the rough, so to speak. Maybe I was one of them. I don't know. Possibly I could even assume maybe I was one of those diamonds as well in the rough, or in the chafe, if you will. But whatever it is, that's one thing that really inspired me, was his approach with other people. Another major thing that really I took away from this was the fact that he came from a background of being a tradesperson. But same thing, like a lot of us, he came from a background of, a middle-class family, and they didn't have money, and none of them did. But what he ended up building was an organization that was extremely successful, and he did it because of his work ethic, his attitude. He built such a network. It's funny because even years later, he sold the business to some new owners, and when he did that, almost all of his old clientele followed him over to the new business. It's just hilarious when I see that. And because business is really largely structured on people. It's not so much the product. It's not what you're selling. It's not, the service. I mean, it is to a point. People want the service. They need that done. But let's face it. You could have the top of the class, but dry as a popcorn fart. Or that other person who's selling the same service, middle of the road in terms of overall quality, but he can sell ketchup to a man with white leather gloves. And he was just that guy. He was that person that had the gift of the gab. He was that person with that great personality. And again, that constantly, it's hard to say. You can't even put a number on it. You can't put a fact to it. You can't even put this on paper. There's no way to calculate this, but there's sort of this aura about him that you just can't really quantify, other than he had that. He was just one of the greatest people I've ever worked with and for in my space of work, ever. Now, one thing I also appreciate, he worked hard, but he played hard. He water skied, he wakeboarded, he played hard. I know Mexico was one of his favorite places, and he played hard there. And the last I had heard, there was something that really happened. On one of his trips to Mexico, I heard that he had a little accident. Now, we always go to these places with the expectation we're gonna, enjoy our time there, and we always feel infallible when we're going to places like Mexico or Hawaii, and we get involved in doing things sometimes that maybe you wouldn't even do at home. They might seem a little risky physically. And it sounded as though he had a little accident, and he hurt himself, and he kind of hurt something upstairs. Well, things were never quite the same after that. Took some recovery. Sounded like he largely got over it. But he was never quite the same individual. But see, more to the point of why he was such an inspiration, even through dealing with those trials, tribulations, injury, the working, the grind, the hustle in his work, trying to build up his business, he always maintained that level of positivity. And it didn't matter if things were going right, if things were going wrong. He always seemed to be a positive gentleman. I'll tell you this much. Here's a funny little story. We always quantified him as saying, those that know who know him, know what I'm talking about. We always kind of assumed he was almost like a cat with 9 lives. He was also one of these gentlemen that have been around a long time, and he could literally think on his feet. One time we had to open up a transformer down in a closed off vault that was gassing, high levels of gas. They were saying it looked like through multiple DGA tests that this transformer was literally on the verge of blowing, and it was creating tons of hydrogen. And hydrogen is, you get different gases coming out of your gas analysis test. And when you get things like acetylene or hydrogen, and those are all different indicators of what's going on, whether you're dealing with partial discharge or some kind of failure within the unit. And this was happening. We were seeing high levels of very quickly accelerating hydrogen levels. And so we said, okay, well, let's go pop the top and just let it dissipate so we can buy ourselves a couple days until a new transformer was fully wired up. Well, here he went, crawled down to the vault, almost with a cigarette in his mouth. And we said, hang on. We'll go in there. We've got the Nomex. We'll crack the lid. We'll let it we'll let it air out and then go on. You're clearly not prepped for it. And then he turned and he smiled with this big crap-eating grin to me, and he said, thanks. Thanks a lot, Mark. I don't know what I was thinking. I really don't know what I was thinking. And from that time, he showed me sides of him that not only was he good, he was a good leader, he was a good friend, but he could also show humility. And humility is one of those things that a lot of people just don't have. They don't want to show it. They can't express it because it would be an admission of some sort of failure or weakness. But he wasn't like that. He didn't turn and give me guff. He didn't give me attitude. He's like, oh, thank you very much. I don't know what I was thinking. So we crawled out, we went in, took care of it, moved on. Job got finished, everything was good. But he's just one of those people that inspired me every single time. And I never said it, and I never told him. And it's unfortunate because sometimes we regret those moments that we don't necessarily, engage ourselves in. And maybe there should have been more times where I said, thanks for taking me on. Thanks for showing faith. Thanks for, appreciating what I do. And this is just wonderful. And that was our working relationship. He was one of my best bosses ever. Probably the best boss I've ever had ever. And we shared some good laughs. We pulled up an old report from years ago. And there was an IR scan report and some inspections on some like 120 volt, 208 volt CDPs and splitter panels and things. But those who know in the electrical industry know that you don't get things like corona discharge. You don't get things like partial discharge. You can get shorting out, but at the low voltage, it doesn't create these phenomenons. You typically don't see that until you're up in that, 10 kV, 12 kV and beyond. But here we found a report of I guess you could say a less experienced tech had written this report and identified some like staining in the CDP and commented that there was some kind of discharge in there, creating, some partial discharge and all kinds of conditions going on. I looked at the boss, he looked at me, we both snickered. I started laughing, and he was laughing inside, but he also didn't want to laugh too hard and, make fun of whatever the situation was and the fact that the information wasn't accurate. He just looked at it and kind of snickered and said, well, I guess we'll have to revisit that and make sure there's no problems. He sort of diverted a little bit with the little snicker, not making me feel awkward and yet not putting down the other person. He was truly a star in the world of high voltage. And he had a massive network of connections and people in the industry. He was highly respected across the whole industry, the high voltage space. And I could go on and on. It isn't about his accolades. That's not what this is about. But what it is really about is the fact that I totally missed it. He had passed last year and I didn't even see that. I didn't know that. See, I was dealing with my own issues. And this is what happens in our lives. We find ourselves enthralled in our own spaces, in our own lives, our own experiences, and all of a sudden, friends, family, people are leaving us on a daily basis. A lot of times we just miss it. We don't even realize it happened until later. I stumbled across an obituary here just a week ago, and I see exactly what had happened and transpired. And it was actually very shocking to me to see that he had left the world back last year in July sometime. And it was really, truly heartbreaking because he was one of my biggest inspirations. He taught me things like empathy, sympathy, patience, hard work, the grind when it matters, hustle, the grind. And I come from a very hard-working background. That's why working for my previous organization was a tough one, because it takes that out of you. The corporate space tells you to stick in your lane, don't worry about what everybody else is doing, basically focus at that 2-foot mark, and you don't need to know 38,000 feet. That's for somebody else to worry about. And so that's when I cared for my work. That's when I really was engaged in my work, was when this gentleman hired me. That was a time when I actually cared and I felt good about what I did. And I worked hard, and I was always willing to not just work hard, but focus and be the best that I could be. And it's like they say, most people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses. And so he's a classic example of one of those people you just don't leave. People just kind of followed him because he was just such a personality. But one of the big things as well that I just want to drop in here that really inspired me, because not only did he have a great group of friends and family, everybody cared for the guy, but he also knew how to live. Again, he knew when it was time to kick the boots off and go have a good time. And that's one of the big things. There's some people that are all in every which angle, but at the end of the day, life's short, and we've got to put it all in perspective. What is a job? What's a means to an end? Sure, we need money to survive. But he knew, even with the fact that he worked and worked and worked, that there was still an importance in focusing on family, travel, hobbies. And he knew exactly that when it's time to turn the lights off, it's time to turn the lights off. But the big thing for me that's really disheartening in all of this is he was 70 years old. And at 70 years of age, that's clearly not even making the mark for anywhere near the average life expectancy. So I can honestly tell you, something else he inspired me. When I heard about this again recently, and that was only a week ago, and I've been sort of living that space already, as you've all known, if you're OGs and been watching the channel for a while, that I truly do believe that life is worth living, and working till you're 67, it should almost be a crime, in my own personal opinion. I get it, people need to survive, but this stems back to the problem. Affordability, taxation. See, we've got the big players, the corporate wheels, and all of those organizations paying you a little pence, but they're taking double that back on the back end. You have nothing left. It's a systemic issue, and it's a problem that creates a new set of problems. You get to a point where you just don't have the finances to break loose, and then that becomes the part of the main problem, is that you need the finances. The more you work, the more you get taxed. The more you need to work, because now to work, you need to buy your new car, your new clothes, and then this continues on. This is just a never-ending cycle of, feeding the animal, if you will. And it's how you break that chain is the most important thing. It's the realization that, yes, I'm stuck on this merry-go-round. I'm stuck on this Ferris wheel, and I need to get off. When this thing gets close to the entry port, I'm going to jump off. And that's sort of the take I took away on this, because, my old boss there, he worked a little longer, probably, in my own personal opinion, than he should have, because he was still dragging up and working for other companies and, still carrying a lot of that in the industry and being that player out there. He did manage to get out, and it appears as though he finally retired. But sadly enough, it's almost too little too late, because, even at 70 years of age, you pull the pin 2 or 3 years earlier, he really didn't have a whole lot of time to actually enjoy. And so, as further to that inspiration, He truly taught me that life is short. We don't know when that time is. I might live to 91, but I might not make it till tomorrow. And he proved to me that again. He was going to keep working on it, keep working, and then he finally retired. And by that time, there wasn't much time left. He may or may not have known that. I mean, that's not something I'm on the inside to know, but sometimes people have that insider trading advantage, so to speak. But you know what? It's just one of those situations that we don't know the time that we've got. And I can't imagine grinding to 65, 67. Like, I totally understand the concept of the healthcare programs, and I understand the lifestyle, and I understand needing to earn a buck, and I understand the paycheck and what it means and the requirements for that. But I also understand that life's short. And so the whole concept is, how do I break this chain? How do I dive off of that proverbial circle, that Ferris wheel? How do I get off of this thing? How do I find this way out? Do I keep watching when that exit, as soon as that exit comes around, I'm going to dive? We all have to kind of make those own decisions. We're all big people. We're all adults in the house. At least by the analytics that YouTube's telling me, the majority of you are in your 40s, 50s, and 60s. That the mass majority of us are more than capable of making that decision of prioritizing. And you know what? Sometimes we make a decision, it's a little too late, and then we regret it. Sometimes we jump off a little too soon, and that hurts us in other ways, financial or what have you. So planning is a big part of it. Getting rid of debt, figuring all of that out, whatever it is that's holding you back. That's the caveat. That's the big catch in this. And understanding that to make that concerted effort is all it takes. I mean, a lot of times people just get on the merry-go-round and they just go round and round and round and around. It's just easy to sit there on that horsey and just go around and around, and you don't even think about it. Nothing changes. Life's easy, right? It's comfortable. It's predictable. We see as we cycle around and we see that exit sign, and we keep seeing it over and over and over and over. And this is just how we live. We see that exit sign over and over again, but we fail to do anything about it. What does that exit sign represent? An opportunity. An opportunity to leave that corporate grind, to do something. Maybe it is that part-time job. Maybe it's skip the corporate grind, because we know that takes a real toll on your health. So maybe it's a matter of just figuring something else out. Maybe start your own little business. Maybe figuring something, side hustle. It don't matter. Maybe there's enough in your 401k now to make it happen. Maybe you've got to simplify a bit. Everybody has their own strategy. Everybody has their own options. But every time you see that exit sign go by, you're on for another lap. You've got to think a little bit that life is short. And this is one thing that I keep seeing more and more. And I think as we age, we see more and more people just leaving us. And it's sad. This is just a truly, truly sad state. Some of these people that are leaving, we find very inspiring. And this such person was very inspiring to me, and it was actually kind of heartbreaking when I saw this, when I saw that obituary. And I knew that he gave everything to his work. He did break away and managed to have a little fun time. But this is again a reminder to me that, when is it too late? Are we going to have that regret? Should we have made a move sooner and found that exit sign?